Without further ado, I'm introducing Dr. Whitney Bendeck. She is a professor of international affairs at Florida State University. Go Noles, there's a few Noles here. Where she also serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies. Her area of specialty is vast. She is included Europe during the World Wars and modern China. She has published 2 books on British military deception during World War II. And Dr. Bendeck's undergraduate courses focus on international affairs broadly, total war, human rights, and modern China. Her graduate courses are all centered on China from the imperial period to the 21st centuries, as well as communism in Asia. In addition, she leads 2 study abroad programs, of which I've done both. International Affairs in London, it's a spring break program, and then a human rights in Prague, which I did in my graduate degree, which is a summer-long program on the Holocaust and international human rights. She was very formative in my education, so I'm excited you guys get to hear from her. Dr. Whitney Bendeck.
All right, and Dominique was one of my best students.
I take great pride in that. I try very hard.
She set the bar kind of high, though, so I'm a little nervous. I feel like it can only go down from here. All right. Well, I have the task of kind of prepping us for where we're going to be going later, which is the Holocaust Museum. So I'm going to start by looking at what was going on in Germany in the 1930s, and then I'll switch slides and move over to one that's just really a timeline narrative of the Holocaust. And the reason I do this is because when I was in school myself, I feel like I always learned the Holocaust in bits and pieces. I learned it in themes, I learned it in this here and there, and I did not understand how everything fit together. And so it was actually kind of confusing to me what was what led to what. And so I try to remedy that in my own classes, kind of give that sense of context. So here, again, we'll be looking at a bit of historical context. We've already seen earlier why history is so important. Helps us to understand these things. And then to build off of what we were just learning about. So we were just learning about, actually you started in the context of it's odd in a way that the Holocaust, the epicenter for this is Germany, considering that you have this rich Christian tradition, both the Protestants and the Catholics. Another thing that's odd is that when you look at Germany, the Jews were largely assimilated there. So Germany, Western Europe, you have high degrees of assimilation for the Jewish population. Now, when we talk about the historic, ghettos and Jewish quarters, you're tending to talk about either previous times in history or Eastern Europe, not Germany in the 1900s. But one thing Germany was not immune to was anti-Semitism. Now, we just learned about religious anti-Semitism. What other kinds were there? Okay, racial, and I'm going to save that one for last. Political. Okay, political. Anybody else? What's that? Okay, maybe. Yeah, sure. I can certainly see it fitting in the academic realm. Anywhere else? Economic. We talked about money lending, usury. Right? Popular, kind of traditional. It's how it's always been, passed down generation from generation. It's what you were taught to believe, so it's what you believe. There are multiple different types of anti-Semitism. So they all kind of come together. But in the 1800s, we have the development of racial anti-Semitism. And this is the one that I wanted to talk about just a little bit before we go into this, because this is going to be the most dangerous form of it. With religious anti-Semitism, a Jew could convert. They could become a Christian. Thus, they could lose their Jewishness. Sometimes that was forcible conversion. But they could convert, and then they were no longer a Jew. They could change their practices if it's economic. People could maybe become more enlightened and move beyond those prejudices that they had been taught, right? Racial anti-Semitism is going to be a bit different. It comes in the context of the 1800s, and so interestingly, prior to this, and tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the evolution of international human rights, when the French Revolution broke out, the French passed what's known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And that is going to recognize very wide sweeping and inalienable rights of all human beings. But we have a problem. Now, by the way, my colleague Hussein also talked about Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars. As the French moved across Europe, they brought those tenets of the rights of man with them all over Europe, including the German states, imposed these ideas. So they became well known. But we have a problem in the 1800s because this is also the time of imperialism, colonization. So now we've had these ideas come about that all people are equal and all people have rights, and yet we also have colonization going on, so how do you justify it? And the development of pseudoscience really fits into this context, and it gave a justification because races weren't equal. Some were inferior, some were superior. And of course, the white race, and in many writings, the Aryans in particular, were identified as a superior race. Well, now that gives a justification for either helping to, I don't know, enlighten inferior populations or subjugate them, whatever that may look like. But this pseudoscience plays into this. Now, this pseudoscience is also where you have your anti-Semitic scholars going to definitely zero in on the Jews, and the Jews would be identified as an inferior race. And those writings became incredibly virulent. You look at the language of them. I mean, they weren't just nasty. They went beyond that, calling the Jews parasites, calling the Jews viruses, calling to exterminate. It was rhetoric in the 1800s. Nobody was really acting on it. It was rhetoric. But remember when you were a kid and your parents taught you, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt you? That's not true. Because what happens is that language impacts thinking. Language is dangerous. And so when you have this 1800s pseudoscience, which leads to this incredibly anti-Semitic rhetoric, and that's not to say that it didn't exist before, but it takes on that scientific element, you start looking at this incredibly dehumanizing language, and the problem is you hear this for decades and decades, and finally in the 1930s, 1940s, this is going to become more than rhetoric. But then you have populations who've been primed. So keep in mind, language matters. The things we say, how we speak about people matters. So that's just a little lesson there. One of the things that really made racial anti-Semitism the most dangerous of the forms is that you can't become not a Jew. You can't convert and then you're not a Jew. You can't change your practices and then you're not considered a bad guy. If you are a Jew by race, that's who you are. Now, by the way, that who you are is an important term when we talk about the definition of genocide. Not where you live, not what you believe, not what you think, not what you did, who you are. That's something you can't change. And that's what's going to make this one so dangerous. And then that's the context, too, when we look at the Nazis. I'm sure you can see multiple elements of anti-Semitism in here, but Adolf Hitler would definitely adhere to the racial anti-Semitism. He considered the Jews a race. So this is coming from that racial anti-Semitism. By the way, the outline is for Dominique. She apparently missed being in my classes, and she wanted an outline. So she got an outline. Thank you. You're welcome. All right. So brief little background. Again, I don't like starting in the middle of a story because I don't want to assume you all know the story. A lot of what I tell you today, you've probably heard. Some of you may know all of it. Some of you may know quite a lot of it, so it may just be a refresher, but I don't want to start in the middle of the story. So just wanted to start really with the Nazis coming to power. So 1920s really wasn't looking too good for the Nazis. They tried to carry out a coup, the beer hall putsch, didn't work. That convinced Hitler and the leadership that they needed to come to power legally. And what you see here is just a diagram of the number of seats the Nazis would get in the Reichstag. And you've got a difference here. Only 12 seats in 1928. 230 seats, which didn't give them a majority, but it did mean they were the party that got the most number of votes in 1932. That's a big jump in numbers. What happened? What happened between 28 and 32? The Great Depression happened. The Weimar Republic, which was the government of Germany post-World War I, had become more stable, gotten its feet on the ground. Things were going reasonably okay for them until the Great Depression. And because of loans between the US and Germany, Germany was hit really hard, really fast. And it was that context that suddenly gave the Nazis the in. Suddenly, Hitler is able to start appealing to the people, and we see the Nazis rise in the number of seats that they're getting through elections. And so that means by 1932, the Nazis get the most number of seats in the Reichstag. At this point, various conservative powers come together and agree, or parties come together and agree, all right, we don't really like this guy, Adolf Hitler. He's a little weird, but he'll be temporary. We'll go ahead and support him becoming Chancellor of Germany. He's not going to be around all that long, so it doesn't matter. January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, who is the president of the Weimar regime, will appoint Adolf Hitler Chancellor. I like this photo. Tell me what you see. Beyond Hindenburg and Hitler, but what do you see in it? Difference. Yeah. Look at the difference between the two men. I mean, Hindenburg was a big man, but he's standing there, tall, strong, shaking Hitler's hand, and Hitler is what? He's meek. He's demure. He's got his head down. He's playing a role. He knew what people thought about him. He knew that they assumed he would be temporary, that they could manipulate him until another chancellor could be appointed. By the way, why would they think another chancellor would be appointed? This is 1933. The Weimar Republic had been in power about 14 years. Adolf Hitler was the 16th chancellor. Nobody stayed in that position long. Some months. Rarely was it years. This turned over rapidly. And so when Adolf Hitler became chancellor, nobody thinks this guy's around to stay. It was really politically turbulent time, so all bets were he was going to be a goner really soon. Hitler knows all of this. When we talk about Adolf Hitler, we talk about how evil he was. We talk about a lot of things about him which were all true. But one thing not to miss in your understanding about Hitler is that he was politically savvy. He was an incredibly smart man where this was concerned. He understood the system. He understood how to manipulate the system, and that's what he would do. That's why he ends up being as successful as he was, because he figured out how to manipulate the system. So here he is, example of his manipulation. He's appointed chancellor. Nobody thinks he's going to be around long. Very quickly, he and the Nazi Party begin taking steps that will establish their complete power. Now, when he became chancellor, he inherited something that helped him. Article 48 had been put in place in 1930 after the Great Depression broke out. At that time, the Germans were really concerned about the communists, that the communists were going to take advantage of the political problems, and this would be the communist opportunity to rise. Chancellors were given the authority to act outside of the Constitution by Article 48. Hitler inherited Article 48. So that means when he came to power, he already had the ability to act outside of the constitutional confines of the Weimar regime. He would use that. It's not even a solid month later, but by the end of February 27th, the Reichstag caught on fire. They blamed the communists. Scholars believe the Nazis were in one way, shape, or form behind this Reichstag fire. But that will then be used. Remember, we've got these emergency powers. That's going to be used to issue a decree. It's famously known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, but it has a longer name, the Protection of the People and the State. But I put here what it did. Now notice, this is the next day. That's awfully fast. Imagine if our government got legislation out so quickly. This is the next day. It suspended all fundamental freedoms of press, or speech, press, assembly, freedom from invasion of privacy, mail, telephone, telegram, from house search without warrant, gave the federal government the power to take over the state governments as needed to restore public security, and impose the death penalty in place of what had been life imprisonment for treason, arson, railroad sabotage, and the like. I love these words, and the like. What does that mean? And treason, who gets to define that? Take a guess. All right, so we have this decree. Now, there's a bigger importance to this than simply the new government is taking advantage of its powers and really staging events to be able to take steps further. Look at all the loss of rights here. I want you to understand this applied to all Germans. This isn't an anti-Semitic legislation. This applies to everybody. So one thing I want you to think about, and we can talk about tomorrow, why didn't people do more? Keep in mind what happens when all your rights are stripped away. So this removes all of those rights from everybody, and most of the time we don't talk about the fact that everybody really lost their protections. All right, so we have the Reichstag Fire Decree. The very next month, Hitler, manipulating the Reichstag, is going to be able to pass the Enabling Act. They used a little persuasion, they used a little coercion, they used a little bribery, they threw people in prison, they did all kinds of things. But ultimately, on March 23rd, 1933, the Enabling Act was passed. The Enabling Act, and again, long term here, the law for removing the distress of the people in the Reich. What this does is it's going to give the Nazis essentially permanent authority to act outside of the Constitution. It was supposed to be for about a 4-year period. Well, we know the rest of that story. There will be no more Reichstag. With this, the Reichstag voted themselves out of existence. There will be no more Reichstag. Now the Nazis can rule by their own accord outside of the Constitution for this given time period. By July of 1933, all parties in Germany had been suspended except for the Nazi Party. It was the only one to still be legal. And Hitler made this statement, the party has now become the state. Look at how quickly that happened. With a chancellor that people thought was kind of weird, a bit eccentric, a nobody, not going to last very long. Within 6 months had taken full control of Germany, and I will point out, he did it legally. Another soapbox moment, be careful which freedoms you're willing to give away. There are always a lot of talks about the Constitution and this and that, and I'm always shocked at how quickly a lot of people are willing to give away freedoms. Don't ever give your freedoms away. Germany gives us a really good example of what happens when you hand your freedoms over. All right, but by July 1933, it was just the Nazi Party, and I just said this part, but this was a legal revolution, which serves as a warning to us. All right, now, we've seen how the Nazis came to power. Our topic here, though, is looking at the 1930s and the implementation of these anti-Semitic policies and legislation. Again here, I'll point out that Hitler was savvy. He was very eager to have the support of the German people. He was very concerned about popular movements against him. Actually, he wanted the people to adore him. He was careful not to do too much too fast. When he spoke, he was careful about who his audience was in terms of what he said. You may say, didn't everybody know how anti-Semitic it was? Well, he didn't spew all that in every speech he gave. So he was careful in playing up to his audience in order to gain support. After the Nazis came to power, initially their measures were really against the communists and other political enemies, and it takes a little while before they start very specifically targeting the Jews. Now, you did have some Jews who were arrested in these early months as political enemies, but it takes until April that we start seeing the anti-Semitic policies going into place. It started off actually with what was intended to be this major and permanent boycott to go into effect on April 1st of 1933. This was to boycott the Jewish businesses. Hitler hoped that there would be widespread support for this. Turns out there wasn't. Also turns out that word of the Nazi Party's anti-Semitic beliefs was getting out. Word of those individuals who had been arrested in terms of being political enemies was getting out. This man, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, who was the head of the American Jewish Congress in New York City, was making a real big stink about it here in the United States, calling attention to what was happening. And so this was starting to put a little bit more international focus and pressure on Germany. So the result was that April 1st boycott ended up being only April 1st, which was Saturday, Sabbath, so a lot of Jewish businesses weren't open anyway. But what was supposed to be permanent ended up being just one day. All right, this is going to be followed just days later, really, with the first anti-Jewish law. And this one, like all of them, have these long names, but the law for the reestablishment of the professional service. Well, what does reestablishment mean? Well, they're Aryanizing it, trying to get rid of the Jews and make sure that this is only for Aryans. So the result was you would have Jews being kicked out of the civil professions, so judges, jurors, assessors, things of the sort. Jews who worked in the entertainment industry, they're out. It would impact education. A Jew's ability to go to university was limited to almost nothing at this point. Jewish children would now have to go to Jewish schools. Remember what I said about how assimilated the Jewish population was? So now you're removing children who may not even consider themselves to be Jews to a separate education, starting to separate, ostracize. So we see this impact education. Jews weren't supposed to farm land because the land was for the Germans. Whole series of things go into effect, and it took about 6 months or so for all of these measures to be put in place. But I will say here, on April 11th, they also worked to define what they meant by non-Aryan. So at this point, they're identifying if you have, I think at that point they were saying 2, maybe it was 3 as well, but 2 or 3 Jewish grandparents, then you were a Jew. So we see an early attempt to identify who they're actually talking about, who was non-Aryan, specifically who was a Jew in this context. So throughout 1933, it was very clear that life for the Jews in Germany was going downhill. So what's their response? What do they do? What do you think? What would you do? Mm-hmm. Go for it.
Any of those Israelites, did they have the authority well, not authority maybe, but did they have the power to leave Germany?
Yes. About 53,000 of them did. However, about 16,000 came back. So the total number for 1933 was 37,000 Jews left Germany. All right, so that's one thing they could do. They could leave. If life wasn't good in Germany, they could leave. 37,000 left. However, then we do have to start asking, well, where do they go? Leaving's easier said than done, and keep in mind, we're talking 1930s, not today. You know, picking up and leaving, where are you going to get a job? How are you going to take care of yourself? I mean, these are big questions today. This would be even more difficult in those particular times. So, we do know a fair number of Jews did leave. But then, oh, thank you. There were other Jews that maybe weren't as concerned. Because remember, initially everybody thought there's no way Adolf Hitler was going to stay in power long. None of the chancellors were lasting more than months, a year or two at best. So many Jews at the time thought, okay, this is a temporary hardship. We'll get through this. Historically, as a Jewish population, they knew bad times. This is part of their collective memory. There are good times and bad. This is one of the bad. We'll hunker down. We'll get through it. And so while we might think, because we're looking at this with hindsight, while we might think that this would be the writing on the wall, mass immigration, with an E, of Jews out of Germany, it's not really what happened at this particular time. And even though life was getting bad, not everybody saw really where this was going. All right, 1934, it's kind of quiet. Really nothing major is going on, and that probably would have added to a sense of, okay, it's not getting worse. You know, we can handle this. He's still in power, but it's not getting worse, so we really don't have any major events that are occurring in 1934 as far as this, any sort of new legislation is concerned. But one thing did happen in 1934 that would be ominous for the Jews. On August 3rd, 1934, President Hindenburg died. He was the last vestige of the Weimar Republic. I mean, he really, as president, was all that was left. When he died, forget the Enabling Act having a time period on it. All that's over. The Weimar Republic's over. Now you have the Third Reich. Now you have Hitler as the Führer. Now he's the commander-in-the-chief of the military. So now Hitler's holding all of these positions of power. No more democracy, no more Weimar Republic, all that's over. And that's going to be ominous for the Jews because Hindenburg had actually offered a bit of support and protection for the Jews, especially the Jews who had served in the military. So when I talked about the policies that went into place in 1933, I didn't say anything about the Jews in the military. That's because Hitler couldn't mess with those Jews because Hindenburg was still around. He's your World War I general, hero, right? They had his protection. Now they don't. 1935. The Jews will be kicked out of the military. Now, I always say I'm a big picture thinker. There's more of a big picture here. 1935, something else big happened. This was the year that Hitler announced Germany would begin rearming. Now, if you know your history, you get why that was important. If you don't know your history, the reason why that's such a big deal is that Germany was prevented from rearming by terms of the Versailles Treaty, which is what concluded World War I for Germany. The terms of that had vastly limited Germany's army. They could not rearm. In 1935, Hitler announced that they would. This was in complete defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. So the fact that the Jews were kicked out of the military the same year, coincidence? No. As the Nazis were going to begin building up their military, which they would simultaneously begin preparing for war, the Jews were not part of that. All right, so we have that. Now, we move forward a number of months, we get to September. And in September, we get the very well-known Nuremberg laws. September 15th is when these come out, and there's really two components to what is initially promulgated here on September 15th. First is the Reich citizenship law. That was very straightforward. To be a citizen, you have to be German, meaning Aryan. Okay, so that one's short and sweet. If you want to be a citizen of Germany, you have to be a German, which means you have to be Aryan. Then this is followed with the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. This would forbid Jews from marrying Aryans. This would forbid sexual intercourse between Jews and Aryans. Jews were also not allowed to employ a female servant or maid in their home under the age of 45. Why? Because she would be of childbearing years. But again, we have the problem of, well, who's a Jew? And so in November, we get clarification on this. So we get the Mischling law. Mischling means mixed blood. Now here it's made clear a Jew is anybody with 3 Jewish grandparents. But beyond that, maybe you're a half Jew, or you're a quarter Jew, or you're 1/8 Jew. So it broke down in all of these different categories, all these different levels of Jewishness based on how many grandparents you had, or were you born of a union between a Jew and a non-Jew, or a Jew and an Aryan, and yet you had been raised Aryan. Now, if you were raised Jewish, you were a Jew, period. No discussion on that. But if you were born of a union between a Jew and an Aryan, but you were raised Aryan, well then maybe you would be okay. Maybe you could be put into this Mischling, this mixed blood category, and could be considered okay. By the way, they did have plans to sterilize the Mischlinge. So that was part of the thought process down the road. Sterilize these people who have Jewish blood in them so that they can't pass on Jewish blood in the future. Here, though, we actually do see that Hitler was still being pragmatic, because there were others who were helping to draft these laws who were a little bit more extreme than him, at least at that time, in terms of how they were categorizing Jews. Some wanted to say if there were any Jewish blood whatsoever, they should automatically be denied everything. Hitler was concerned about upsetting the Aryan population. He was he was concerned about doing anything that could bring about negative attention or any sort of a popular movement against him. So he was still being a bit more pragmatic, if you will, in how he was looking at this, at least how he was categorizing it legally. Now, this is one of those big moments in history, and we always look back at this moment because this is when the Jews lost their citizenship. And for us, again, we're looking at it with hindsight. It's 2020. We know exactly where it's going. We know what this is leading to. And so in our minds, this is kind of that moment when we're wondering, why aren't the Jews doing anything? You know, do they realize? So let me start with the Jewish response. What is the Jewish response to this? And make sure I have my number right. But before, we had 37,000 people leave. Where do I have that page? Yeah, 37,000 Jews left in 1933. 21,000 left after the Nuremberg laws, or in 1935 in general. You would think it'd be higher. So 21,000, less than 1933. Why might the Jews not have been as alarmed by this as you think? Dominique?
You're used to oppression in Europe throughout
Yeah.
the Middle Ages to like modern.
History. This is nothing new. Throughout time, they have had rights, lost rights. They've had citizenship, lost citizenship. When Napoleon came through, he forced the German states to grant the Jews all these pervasive rights. After the French left, out with all that. I mean, for the Jews, they're used to this. It has gone back and forth throughout history. Again, as a people with a collective memory, they know they've had these bad times before. So here they're thinking, well, this isn't great, but you know what? Subjects still have protection under the law. And in fact, these laws actually made it sound like they would still have some value in society, that they would still be protected in some way in society, so they could hold on to that. Well, you know, they weren't expelled, they still had rights of subjects and so forth, so they don't see what we're able to see with hindsight informing us of where this is going. But what about the international community? So when we look at this, we often wonder, well, what was the international community doing? What was their response? Well, first you've got the Great Depression. So keep in mind, 1930s, the economies from the United States across Europe aren't so great. So the idea now of just taking in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever it may be, of people really doesn't sound very appealing to countries that are facing dire economic problems, struggling to get out of them. So we can't forget that the Great Depression was going on, and we had this economic turmoil that's being felt across the globe. Well, let's not act like anti-Semitism wasn't an issue either, because you also have anti-Semitism across Europe, in the United States. So anti-Semitism exists. We've talked about the fact that there's multiple different levels of that. But you have people who maybe wouldn't have been so friendly to accepting Jews in particular. What about the United States? I often feel like students will say, yeah, but the United States, we should have done something. All right, well, this applied to us as well. This is the time of the New Deal. You know, United States trying to get things back in place. One thing we can forget historically is we weren't the world's major power at that time. We didn't want to be the world's major power at that time. We had the opportunity after World War I to step up. We didn't. Why? Because we didn't want to. We didn't want to be involved in Europe's affairs. We went home. We talk about isolationism, right? So it wasn't us. If anybody was still kind of in that position, it was Britain. So that wasn't us. That's not the role we were playing at that time. And then one other aspect of the United States, we know our history. Were things equal here? No. So who are we to point a finger at Germany and say, you're not going to allow the Jews to have full rights? Hello? I mean, look at what was going on in the United States at the time. We have segregation. We have Jim Crow. We have all that. Who are we to point the finger at Germany? So we have an international community that for various reasons wasn't stepping up to the plate. Many, again, we also have to acknowledge nobody knew where this was going. So the world knew about what was going on in Germany, but, you know, bad times, they'll get through it. Didn't seem so alarming. What about the German people? I asked this question because I want us to think about some things that are going on right now. Okay, we come back to anti-Semitism. So even though the Jews had been largely assimilated, we have anti-Semitism in Germany, so that would have been the case for some of them. Have no idea what percentage of the population that may be, but obviously that would exist for some people. Apathy. Now, I don't mean this that they intentionally didn't care, but they're living their own lives. They've got their jobs. They've got their family. They've got their own concerns. They're just completely involved in what's going on in their own lives, and they're not really paying attention to what's going on outside of them. This is not the age of the internet or social media either, so your awareness is going to really be based on how aware you want to be, or if you live in a city as opposed to a rural area, where a lot of things can impact how much people even know. So there's kind of this element of apathy where people are more concerned with what impacts them directly and not what's not impacting them. Fear of repercussions. Go back to that Reichstag fire decree. That applied to everybody. So if you're a German who decides that you're going to oppose the Nazi regime, don't you think that law could come back and get you? When you have people who are already being thrown into political prisons, Dachau, for example, first one to be created, but you already have people being thrown into these political prisons, are you going to speak up when that could happen to you? So fear of the repercussions of what may happen, and then just an underestimation of its severity because people didn't know where it was going. We often look at the Germans. Why didn't the Germans do anything? Why didn't the Germans say anything? Well, there were certain groups of people who were concerned and who did say things, but obviously it only went so far. We're in 2024 America. I never thought I would see the rise of anti-Semitism in this country that we're seeing right now. Utterly shocking to me. What do we have right now? A rise in anti-Semitism. Apathy on the part of so many people who are more concerned with going to school, their job, their families. You know what? It doesn't impact me. I'm just not going to worry about that. We have that going on right now. I'm very much paraphrasing, but there's the statement, evil prevails when good people do nothing. We've got apathy, fear of repercussions. What if I say something? And we've got this politically charged environment in this country. What if I say something and I get fired? Dominique was wondering if I even wanted my name on this because I work at a public university. What if I say something and I get fired? People come after me, right? Fear of repercussions. What if it's not even I'm going to get fired? Just what if my coworkers are going to come after me? What if people are going to start bashing me on social media? What if my neighbors won't talk to me anymore? You think we have this going on right now? Yep. Underestimation of its severity. Well, I can't predict the future. But history tells us, be careful about this one. Be careful that we don't write it off as nothing. Remember what I said about words matter? Language matters. Language is dangerous. All this is at play right now. Keep that in mind. All right, so we have Nuremberg, 1935, kind of a watershed year in many ways, especially looking back at it historically. Just ask this question, but are we at risk of repeating history? Something we need to be very aware of and paying attention to. 1936. It's quiet again. Actually, 1936, kind of okay year. Why? Germany hosted the Olympics. Well, now we have to put a nice face for the world. We've got to take down all those anti-Semitic posters, all those things we had posted around the cities. We've got to take that down because now we've got to look good for the world. This was, by the way, the first time that countries threatened to boycott an international event over human rights. They didn't, but it's the first time we see that threaten of a boycott. So we have Germany host the Berlin Olympics, 1936. Of course, from our own history of the big story of Jesse Owens, where Hitler was shaking hands of people who were winning gold and wouldn't shake Jesse Owens' hand. I just watched an excellent documentary on this just a few days ago. All right, but because of that, again, from the Jews' side of things got better in 1936. 1937, not a whole lot happening. Really, why? Well, because Hitler's focused on preparing Germany for war. He's got a timetable, resources are going into that, planning's going into that, and so that's really the focus. 1937, things are calm. Then we get to 1938 and things are going to intensify real fast. Because now Germany is starting to take those steps that it needs to take to prepare for war, which is creating this greater Germany, expanding its borders in a way to be able to protect it as the war, before the war machine would actually hit the battlefield. So in 1938, March of 38, we have the Anschluss. I had it on the outline, but you have the Anschluss. This is when the Germans rolled into Austria. They're actually all ethnically German, but rolled into Austria, and Austria gets incorporated then into this greater Germany, something that had been talked about since World War I. And so Austria becomes part of Germany. This is kind of hard to see on this screen, but what you see are people standing around watching, and then you've got Jews down here scrubbing the ground. All of the laws and legislation that had been put into place in Germany over time are put into place in Austria just about overnight. I mean, the Austrian Jews are hit with it fast. And for a Nazi regime that didn't like Jews, kind of ironic, everywhere they went, they got a whole lot more Jews. And when they go into Austria, they get at least 200,000 more Jews that they have to deal with. So all that anti-Semitic legislation goes into place. This is an image of the public humiliation of the Jews. And so things start to intensify. Now, I want to make a long story, well, I'll get to that long story. I have to make a long story short. This also happened in 38. Jews will now have to identify themselves on their official paperwork. So you see this marked with the J for Judah. Then they also had to adopt, females, the name Sarah, and for males, Israel, so that by name alone, they could be identified as Jews on their paperwork. So all females had to incorporate the name Sarah, all males the name Israel on their paperwork. The Judah badge wouldn't go into effect as being mandatory until 1941, but that was coming as well. So we have these measures. We've seen ostracization. This is identification. We've seen the discrimination, starting to see the persecution, but this is identification. All right. The big thing that happens in 1938, aside from incorporating Austria, which is here, incorporating Austria into Germany, is Kristallnacht. And this is where I said I'll have to make a long story short, but essentially after the Germans took Austria, Poland became concerned. Poland had a large Jewish population. They didn't have a good relationship with their Jews. I go to Poland pretty regularly. They don't like to admit this today. But the anti-Semitism in Poland was really off the charts. They didn't like the Jews. And a large number of Polish Jews had immigrated into Germany, into Austria over the years. And so Poland decides, you know what? We're going to put a law that says any Polish Jew that left Poland and hasn't been here for 5 years loses their citizenship, can't come back. So they did this right after the Anschluss of Austria, recognizing the warning signs like, hey, a lot of our Polish Jews who've left are about to come back. We don't want them back. So they give until the end of October for Jews to decide where they're going to be, and if they don't come back, too late. 3/5 of Germany's Jews by this time are foreign, or 3/5 of Germany's foreign Jews, I should say, were Polish. They start deporting Polish Jews, sending them back to Poland. At least, I'd say 18,000 of them get sent from Germany into Poland. And a lot of times they're just being dumped over the border. In this last minute, right before the deadline, literally just being dumped over the border. No way to take care of themselves. Nowhere to live. Nothing. Just dumped. The 17-year-old Jew in Paris, Herschel Greenspan, received a letter from his sister being informed that their family had been deported to Poland. He was livid. He decided to go to the German embassy in Paris. His goal was that he was going to kill the German ambassador. He doesn't get to meet with the ambassador. A lower-ranking secretary comes out, Ernst von Rott. He comes out. Greenspan shot him. He died 2 days later. Hitler is going to seize on this, though, because now we're in November. We're actually getting close to the anniversary of the beer hall putsch, which, in Nazi history, the Nazis who died had become martyrs. This was legendary for them. So all this is kind of coming together towards the anniversary of that. Hitler decides this is a really good time to unleash the SA on the Jewish population in Greater Germany. And that's what Kristallnacht is. It's a pogrom. November 9th through 10th, 1938. The SA was given the task of going after Jewish synagogues, Jewish businesses. They hoped the German people would get involved, although there was disappointment here again that the German people didn't get so involved. They weren't as enthusiastic about it as the Nazi leadership hoped that they would be. But nonetheless, you can see what's going on here. The synagogue's on fire. You see the water here coming from the fire trucks? That's not putting the fire out from the synagogue. That's putting water on the buildings next door so that they didn't catch on fire. Here are some other images. And Yad Vashem tells us 1,400 synagogues were attacked. 261 synagogues destroyed, largely Germany, but you can see this also took place in Austria. This is where it gets its name, Kristallnacht meaning night of broken glass. It gets its name from the attack on the Jewish businesses as they busted in the windows, destroyed these businesses. So it was a very messy affair, at least 8,000 businesses targeted. 30,000 Jewish men sent to these prison camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, primarily here. And you can see their locations. 30,000 Jewish men then sent to these have to pay their way out. At least 91 people killed. This was a pogrom, but it's interesting because it's the only one in Germany. The Germans didn't like messiness. They tend to be very efficient. They tend to be industrious. They didn't like the mess. There was a big mess to clean up. There literally was glass everywhere. Buildings burnt down, things shattered. It was a mess. They won't do it again. From here forward, the violence is going to take place outside of Germany. So this is really the one example, the height of the persecution that you're going to see in Germany proper. Everything that else is going to happen outside of Germany's borders, and Hitler did that too, again, being savvy, knowing that the German people didn't have the stomach for it. It needed to be hidden away from the eyes of the German people so that they didn't know the reality of what was going on. So he's going to keep it as far from them as he can. All right, but we have this. This is one of those big moments where obviously you have major escalation. It's turned into violence, very open persecution. Again, well known globally. This wasn't a secret what happened. So this is the New York Times reporting it here. I'll point out 1938 is also the year that now the Nazi government would go after the Jews economically. So they've already gone after them in terms of the civil professions, social, cultural aspects, the arts, education, military. They had left the Jewish economic realm off the table because the Jews actually did a lot for Germany's economy. So that had been left off. Now, 1938, those Jewish businesses are going to be Aryanized. The Jews are going to have to register them, their property confiscated, and so forth. So now we get to see the full economic persecution come in 1938. Again, we've got the question of, at this point, what should they do? Should they remain in Germany and Austria, or should they try to go somewhere else? And if it is go somewhere else, where should they go? Most who did leave would go to Western Europe. Some may go to Britain, some may be able to get as far as the United States or Canada, but obviously because of logistics, the prime destination was Western Europe, which unfortunately meant every one of those Jews was doomed once the war was in effect and the Nazis conquered those areas. So those Jews really just bought themselves time. It's a map just really showing where they may go, from Netherlands, Belgium, France being prime locations. A number of countries, the United States is one of them, would step up the number of Jews that we accepted. We've accepted the full quota of people from the Germany, Austria area that we could accept by way of our immigration laws at that time. So we took 30-something thousand Jews in between 1938 and 39. Britain increased the number of Jews that they took in, and then notably, of course, the Brits also enacted the kinder transports. So they would allow 10,000 unaccompanied children to come to Britain. They had to have sponsors, but they allowed 10,000 unaccompanied children to come, recognizing that the situation had become very dire for these children. Unfortunately, most of these children would not have homes or family to go home to once the war was over. All right, but we can see efforts after Kristallnacht and after the events of 1938 by the international community recognizing, okay, the situation's getting worse, and some efforts were increased. The Germans were also increasing their efforts. These two men, Adolf Eichmann and Reinhard Heydrich, would enact, and actually Eichmann was the first to do this in Austria, but the Central Office for Jewish Immigration, again, immigration with an E, meaning to leave. So they erected these offices to help the Jews to leave, to encourage them to leave Germany and Austria. Now, they imposed a 25% flight tax on their wealth, so unless you really had means to be able to leave, you probably weren't going to do it. But even the Nazi leadership was trying to help the Jews leave. And I don't say that like they were being kind. All right, this just gives you some numbers. Of the 500,000 Jews in Germany and 200,000 Jews in Austria, this is starting, marked at the 1933 point. You can see how many had left by the outbreak of war. So obviously you have the shock of 1933, but then those numbers start to go down. Of course, 1938 and 39, you see much higher numbers of Jewish immigration after the events of 38 made it very clear that things were going terribly in the wrong direction. 1939, we get war. So I'm going to have Dominique help me change slides, but I have this up real quick, just showing the prelude to war, prelude to 1939. And you can see that the things the Nazis did, they withdrew from the League of Nations right after they came to power, announced rearmament in 35, remilitarized the Rhineland in 36. All that was in violation of Versailles. Annexed Austria in 38. Of course, we had the Munich conference. They got the Sudetenland, so that's here. Took over Czechoslovakia in March of 39. signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in 39, and then September, we're going to be at war. So now I just want to do a review of what happens when the war breaks out, because everything we've talked about so far, we're not in the Holocaust yet. You've got discrimination, you have persecution, things have been getting bad. We're not in the Holocaust yet. We're not there until we've got war. And the Nazi regime would use war as a cover to carry out what we know as the Holocaust. I had a thing where I was just going to briefly mention Hitler. We don't really know exactly what warped his brain like it did. When he was in his teens, he spent time in Vienna, and he seemed to be very inclined towards extremism, towards radical thought. He really was introduced to this extremist anti-Semitic movement when he was in Vienna as a teenager. And it seemed to just kind of build from there, but obviously he had latched on to the racial element of that. Now, he was a bit contradictory, because even though he said the Jews were a race and that's how he viewed them, if he wasn't sure, he would use religion to suffice, or he would use just physical characteristics or whatever. So if in doubt, but he adhered to the racial version of anti-Semitism. All right, 1939, the war began on September 1st. This is when the Germans invaded Poland. Incidentally, because of that non-aggression pact that they had signed with the Soviets, there was a secret clause that allowed for the Soviets to take the eastern part of Poland. And so a couple weeks after the Germans invaded, the Soviets invaded from the other side. So Poland gets hit from two sides. The Russians will take the east, the Germans take the west. But the German side is divided up into two components. So the very western part, this is going to be land for Germany, good, fertile land, Lebensraum, living space for the Germans. All right, so this is going to go to the Germans. This is known as the general government, and there's really no better way to describe it than it's a dumping ground. They force the Poles off of their land and send them into here, and of course, the Jews. And so the general government becomes essentially this dumping ground for everybody that the Nazi regime didn't want on German territory. So keep in mind the general government, because this is ground zero for really the worst of everything, really what we associate most with the Holocaust: ghettos, death camps. Now, on September 21st, 1939, Reinhard Heydrich issued this directive. It was highlighted as a temporary plan, which was said to be distinct from the final aim. What's the final aim? Well, the Germans were so good about never putting this stuff in writing. If they had just told us what they believed was the final aim, we wouldn't have to debate this. Scholars get into big fights over what this means. Is it just expelling the Jews? Is it just getting rid of the Jews? Or is it exterminating the Jews? Well, the final aim's one of those. But these were identified as temporary plans, distinct from the final aim, which were to be kept secret. And interesting that they need to keep it secret. One, to relocate all Jews from the countryside to the cities of the general government, and then two, create Jewish councils, or Judenräte, led by respective Jewish elders to help assist in their efforts. Again, smart. You take Jewish leaders, people who are respected by the Jewish community, put them as middlemen, because the people are more likely to listen to them. Those leaders are more likely to think that maybe they can do something to help protect the people. Put them in these positions to assist the efforts. This is ultimately the beginning of ghettoization. So putting Jews in ghettos, the very first one we saw at the end of 39, but it's 1940 into 41 when we see the major project of ghettoization taking place. So this shows you a small view of the concentration of ghettos, and you can see that they're mostly being formed here in the general government. This is to 41. So these would be the first ghettos. Now, this shows you what this ends up looking by the end of 42. Well, there's over 1,000 of them. And of course, this would also correspond with the German war plans as the Germans begin to move east. Right, but look at all these ghettos. 1941, we have Operation Barbarossa. So this was the military plan to invade the Soviet Union. Now, before they ever went in, they trained a group of SS known as the Einsatzgruppen. It means Special Task Force. They're killers. They're execution squads. It's led by the SS, but they weren't all members of the SS. They were coming from all levels of society, actually. But they were being trained specifically to serve as killers. They would follow the army. And so now we start to see the War of Annihilation. When the Germans went into Poland, they didn't actually begin the process of annihilation yet. They began the process of concentration, concentrating the Jews into the general government so that they were stuck. But the mass killings had not started. People may have been dying in large numbers of starvation and elements, but the mass killings hadn't started. The mass killings started with Operation Barbarossa, June of 1941. So the German army, the Wehrmacht, goes into Russia in these three prongs, north, center, and south, so that the army can continue doing what the army was designed to do, which was war, make war, expand. The army needed to keep moving. The Einsatzgruppen is trained to go in behind the army to help to consolidate all of this territory that's being taken and essentially get rid of the Jews. So they go into the towns, they go into the villages, kind of a similar story everywhere they go. They're able to find out who the Jewish population was. A lot of times synagogues kept excellent records of all their members, so then they knew who all the Jews were in the town. Men sent out for labor. A lot of times they were digging trenches. Women and children separated. Eventually, the women and children would be marched out of the town too, told that they're going to meet up with the men. They typically would be brought to the trenches that the men may have just dug, where everybody was executed. The greatest example of that came at Babi Yar. And I say greatest, there were a couple other on a similar scale. But this one in September of 1941, 33,771 people killed in 2 days. All shot the same way. They lined them up, stripped the women down to their undergarments, lined them up, shot them. They fell into the trench. Next group, come, line them up, shoot them, fall into the trench. They did this over and over and over again, to the point they killed 33,771 people in 2 days. I wish this was the only story of those executions. There's too many of them to tell, because they did the same thing everywhere they went. Why are they killing them? Because they're Jews. What crime had they committed? They were Jews. That's it. It's based on these anti-Semitic hatred and the fact that the Nazi leadership saw no room for the Jews in their world, in their Aryan world. Now, what became problematic, if you will, is that this was a very personalized way of killing. These soldiers had to face the people that they were going to kill, sometimes spent days with them, and then had to walk with them, literally march them out to their execution place, stare them face to face while they killed them, and it took a toll on the executioners. They were becoming alcoholics. They were starting to have real bad mental health issues, and the leadership realized this isn't the most efficient system. It's also, when you're shooting over 1 million people, you're also using a lot of bullets that are not being used to fight the war, and it's taking a toll on the men, and so the Nazis decide they need a more efficient system. In Russia, they started using gas vans. They used a lot of deception with this, told them that they were going to be taking a ride, going somewhere else, but then they would put the pipes from the outside in, and so the carbon monoxide would kill the people. Still not the most efficient system, but this would be an improved version. This would be at the Helmnode death camp. So they did improve upon what looked like the RV to a much larger version that could kill quicker. And of course, then this is going to become an even larger idea into the death camp plan, developing 5 distinct death camps where Jews would be sent and killed in a very industrialized way, like the assembly line, processed through, fed into a gas chamber, bodies taken out, whole process, efficient, could kill a lot of people at one time. 1942 is when we mark this transition. Have to be kind of careful with these words, and Dominique she cut my time short, so I'm trying to hurry. We mark January of 1942 because that's when we had the Wannsee Conference. And so January 1942, you have these various leaders and administrators of the Nazi regime who meet in Wannsee. You can see Heydrich's there. Eichmann is there. And then a bunch of, I call them paper pushers. You have a lot of administrators. You look at their titles, a lot of secretaries and paper pushers. A lot of times people say this is when they decided upon the final solution. I take big issue with that. This isn't when they decided on the final solution. This is when they formalized the final solution. Why do we know that? Because back in 1941, the order had already been given months before to transition Auschwitz into a death camp. Chelmno was already functioning as a death camp the month prior. Other plans were being made to transition the other camps. They had other purposes in most cases. So this was already in motion. This wasn't decided here. This was rubber stamped here. This was really just a process of logistics. Here's what everybody needs to do. We're going to get this organized. We're going to formalize it so everybody knows their part, and boom. But 1942, after Wannsee, then this paves the way full on for the operation of the death camps. The 5 death camps we have: Auschwitz, Chelmno, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Belchitz. I keep saying 5, it's 6. Sorry, I don't know why I'm saying 5. But there were 6. All right, so we have the 6, correcting myself, death camps. That was their purpose. Even though, say, at Auschwitz, you still had a labor component. You still had a concentration component. Birkenau, the death camp side of Auschwitz, was designed to kill as many people as quickly as they could. So this begins then that process of depersonalized assembly line, industrial style killing, when now they could kill mass quantities of Jews. Now there's a big debate in Holocaust studies whether it was always the plan to exterminate the Jews. The intentionalists believe this was the plan. The Nazis had to get it sorted out how they were doing it, but it was always the plan. Others believe it just kind of evolved into that when other plans didn't work. There were a couple plans, like the Madagascar plan of sending the Jews to Madagascar. I would argue that was also a death sentence. You're talking a largely, basically an uninhabited island with no way to take care of them. I don't know how they were supposed to live there. But nonetheless, 1942 until these camps are liberated, beginning in 1944, Auschwitz, January of 1945, we have the death camps, which are situated, as you see, mostly in the general government. Through this process, you have the annihilation or the liquidation of Europe's Jews. They started in the East. They started by having to clear out the ghettos because the ghettos were overpopulated. So they started in the East with the ghettos, and then they began to move west. And that's where I said those Jews who had left Germany, they tend to be the first ones put on trains after the Nazis began rounding up the Jews in those Western European countries. You look at this map gives us a sense of how large the scale is. It's massive. From the death camps to the labor camps, to the POW camps, to the transit camps. It's massive. Just imagine the manpower that went into this. Just imagine the transport system, all the trains that were taking people to death camps instead of taking soldiers to the Eastern Front, where the Germans were losing the war by, February of 1943, when they get turned around. But the trains are still going to the death camps. Look how big this is. It really puts into perspective how large this operation actually was.
I see euthanasia center. What is that?
The youth, yeah, so there were either 5 or 6, now I'm iffy on if I have my numbers right, but 5 or 6 of those in Germany. And so with the euthanasia centers, those were the only things in Germany, but that wasn't for the Jews, that was for the disabled. So people who were Aryan, but they were people who the Nazis didn't want to procreate and who didn't think were viable members of German society because they had a physical or mental deformity, and it went from children to adults. Yeah. All right, last thing I want to say, because we're going to Auschwitz. Can I have like a minute and a half, 2 minutes? Okay, so these are familiar images that we see of the Holocaust. You know, the people in they're in the camp uniforms, or they're in tattered clothing and they're emaciated, and you really can't even tell one distinguishing feature from another because everybody's in the same state. I took this photo in Auschwitz itself, Auschwitz I, and I took it because I actually don't like it. They have this one hall where they have all these images of the men, and they're in uniform, and you actually almost can find yourself falling into the Nazi propaganda walking down that hall, because you get to the point you just see prisoners, you see criminals. Well, that's not why they were there, right? But you lose the sense that these are human beings, that these are individuals, that these are people who didn't belong there. That they're not criminals, they're in striped uniform, but they're not there because they're criminals, they're there because they're Jews. And we can look at images of this and we can become desensitized. We can lose sight of the tragedy, and I'm going to go forward real quick. I don't like to really attribute a lot to Joseph Stalin, but he said this, and it's so true. One death is a tragedy. 1 million is a statistic. And when you start talking about 6 million Jews and this and that, the number's so big it becomes overwhelming. You start losing your sense of the individual tragedy that was the Holocaust. And teachers, professors, think of different ways to try and make you conceptualize it. Think of the numbers, how many people in a stadium, how many stadiums, marbles in a jar, pennies in whatever it may be. I take a totally different approach. Instead of trying to get you to conceptualize 6 million, I want you to conceptualize 1. I have 2 pictures, families. Look at one face. 1. Give that one person a story. Because what I want you to understand, and when you go to the Holocaust Museum, what I want you to understand is that this isn't a 6 million person statistic. Every person killed was a human being. Everyone. He was a father, he was a brother, he was a husband, he had a profession, he had a personality. He had hopes, he had dreams, he had fears. He's just like us. I'm going to cry. All right, but just like us. And when you think about it like that, you truly understand the tragedy of this. Every single person was a valuable member of their family, a valuable member of their society, somebody who had something to give. Somebody who is known for something, somebody who is loved and cherished, somebody who did not deserve what happened to them, did not deserve to be one of these images on the wall, completely indistinguishable from the person next to them, right? Every single one is a tragedy. So as you think about it, I just want to encourage you, don't think of the big number, take it down to one. Understand the human tragedy of what happened. Okay.